Cunard. It's really an honor to speak as part of Douglas Week, and I really want to start by commending the work of the organizing committee. It's really fantastic work, and I'm sure many of the conversations that have been started as part of this week will have a really transformative impact. Before we get started, I just want to introduce you to my fellow panelists and give you an idea as well of how we're going to structure the panel this evening. So my fellow panelists can also unveil themselves on their Zoom chats as well. So in order of who will be speaking, Dr. Muiris MacGiollabhuí is the Moore Livingston Fellow for the 2020-21 academic year at the Keogh Norton Institute for Irish Studies at the University of Notre Dame. He finished his PhD in history at the University of California, Santa Cruz in June of 2019. And his next article, which is very relevant to our discussion, is Irish Liberty, Black Slavery and the Green Atlantic, the Racial Ideology of the United Irishmen, which explores the contradictions of United Irish racial ideology in the early 19th century. His current book project, Sons of Exile, The Atlantic History of the United Irishmen, 1791 to 1830, explores the histories of the United Irishmen throughout the Atlantic world after the failed 1798 rebellion. He's also begun research for a second book project, which is a comparative history of exiles in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Our next speaker will be Anne Donlon. Anne holds a doctorate in English from the Graduate Center, City University of New York. She edited a volume of correspondence and poems, Langston Hughes, Nancy Cunard, and Louise Thompson, Poetry, Politics, and Friendship in the Spanish Civil War, and has published on work created by authors engaged in anti-fascist and anti-racist organizing in the 20s and the 30s, including in journals such as PMLA, Palimpsest, a journal on women, gender, and Black International. She also writes about the intersection of archives and digital scholarship and works as project manager for digital initiatives in the Department of Scholarly Communication at the Modern Language Association. So I'm going to bring up some slides just to introduce our discussion. So what our event is going to look like, I'm going to first set the scene, briefly introduce you to Emmet and Cunard through their link to one another and how all of this connects back to what we're looking at as part of Douglas Week. Then my co-panelists will introduce each figure in more depth. We're speaking on Thomas Addis Emmet and Anne speaking on Nancy Cunard. And after that, we're going to jump into the discussion portion of our talk, where each of us will unpick some of the wider resonances of these two rebels, particularly in thinking through the themes of anti-racism, solidarity, and transatlantic journeys that we've been highlighting as part of Douglas Week. So, to begin. How come, white man, is the rest of the world to be formed in your dreary and decadent image? So asked Nancy Cunard in a 1931 pamphlet denouncing the racism of her Irish-American socialite mother and her mother's friends. The question speaks to some of the themes of our event this evening, which is at once a conversation about the complex thought, actions, and writing of two figures who engaged with racial justice in the transatlantic world, and also a discussion about the political legacies that passed through a family. The careers of the Irish Republican lawyer Thomas Addis Emmet, born in Cork in 1764, and the British author Nancy Cunard, born in England in 1896, were separated by a century, yet shared many parallels. For Thomas Addis Emmet, whose life took in both the 18th and 19th centuries, the anti-slavery movement will become a constant feature of his politics in Ireland and in exile as a member of the United Irishmen following the 1798 rebellion. Of course, the Emmet name is familiar to all students of Irish history because it was Robert Emmet, younger brother of Thomas, who led the Irish Rebellion of 1803. A century after the Emmet brothers and their respective revolts, Nancy Cunard was born to Sir Batch Cunard, the wealthy heir to the Cunard shipping fortune, and Maud Cunard, an American socialite. As an artist, editor, and activist, Nancy Cunard would emerge as one of the most dynamic organizers of the global struggle against racism in the interwar period. And these two rebels, Emmet and Cunard, shared a further point of connection. Nancy Cunard was Thomas Addis Emmet's great-great-granddaughter. While Nancy Cunard's scholars long knew about Cunard's boast that her family ancestry could be traced back to the revolutionary Emmets, the assertion was left unproven. This was largely because scholars, understandably but incorrectly, believed that the family link stretched back through Nancy's mother Maud and her Irish-American family. However, as I recently explored in an Irish Times article on Nancy Cunard, it was her father's side, the Cunard shipping fortune side, that linked to the rebel Emmets. In 1849, as you'll see on this family tree, 4 years after Frederick Douglass set sail for Ireland on board a Cunard Line ship, the Cumbria, Mary McEvers, granddaughter of Thomas Addis Emmet, married into the Cunard family. Mary McEvers in turn had a son, Sir Batch Cunard, who was Nancy Cunard's father. The story of Thomas Addis Emmet and Nancy Cunard is therefore an interlinked history of Irish diaspora anti-racism. And for those of you listening in, I want this event really to introduce you to two fascinating figures whose lives deserve to be better known, particularly when it comes to the stories of racial justice. They are two figures whose lives might also point us to certain discontinuities and uneven political genealogies of the anti-racist history we are currently recounting as part of Douglas Week. And I'm also keenly aware that we are three white panelists talking about two white activists who talked about race, and that, I think, compels us to discuss the nature of allyship and confront the limits of Emmet and Cunard as figures whom we might hold up as contemporary models. And regardless of where our conversation takes us, it seems to me that Emmet and Cunard certainly lived up to Douglas's famous exhortation and call to agitate, agitate, agitate. So with our scene set, I'm looking forward, personally, also to learning more about Emmet and Cunard from these two experts on their lives. So firstly, Muiris, I would like you to tell us about Thomas Addis Emmet and his world.
Thank you, Maurice. Lovely to meet you all. Thank you for taking time out of your day to be here to talk about such an important, detailed and rich history of these very important historical figures. Let me start off by telling you a little bit about Emmet's background and how that informed some of his politics, how it informed the direction that he took in life. He's born in 1764, as Maurice has shown, in Cork, importantly for the geographical details of this week with Frederick Douglass. He will go to Edinburgh actually to study medicine. He will be actually eclipsed in some ways by his older brother, who many of us have heard of, Robert Emmet, and some of us have heard of Thomas Addis Emmet. None of us have heard about Christopher Temple Emmet. Temple Emmet, as he was referred to, was the eldest son. He was the lawyer of the family, and he was seen as the bright, shining star of the Emmet line. He dies completely unexpectedly in 1788, and Thomas Addis Emmet has this moment of, like, what does this mean for me? What am I going to do with my life? And not under pressure from his family per se, but from a family friend. He's kind of veered in the direction of law, just like Temple had, the older brother. And he goes on and he gets a law degree, and he'll become part of the Irish bar in 1790. It's at this moment, at this kind of juncture in Irish history, that he becomes involved in politics, effectively. The thing that draws him into politics originally, that's Thomas Addis, is the Catholic Committee. This is a movement that starts in the 1790s and which will be taken up by the United Irishmen throughout the 1790s, which will be an appeal and a call and for some a demand for Catholic emancipation, something that won't be achieved until the 1820s. So he becomes involved in the Catholic Committee, and from there he becomes involved with a group called the United Irishmen, who I study. The United Irishmen are formed in 1791, and they have two kind of main centres of activity. One in Belfast, which is kind of the heart and the soul of the United Irishmen, and the second is in Dublin, which is important, and the one that Thomas Addis Emmet is involved with, but not quite as important as the Belfast centre. The United Irishmen, they really wanted three things. separate but interconnected in many ways. First of all, they wanted Catholic emancipation. They wanted political reform. They believed that there was an unevenness and equality in terms of how Irish politics were oriented at the beginning of the 1790s. And the third thing that they wanted was a belief, in part because the United Irishmen were made up in part by merchants, specifically northern merchants. They wanted a loosening of English control on the merchant classes in Ireland. So these three things are what are spurring the United Irishmen. They're started in 1791 as a reform organization, but by 1795, they're unsuccessful in the vast majority of their aims. It's in this moment that they make a decision, in part because a French invasion of Ireland occurs in 1795, and then a second one in 1796, which pushes the British Empire to start to consider the United Irishmen to be this kind of subversive, dangerous group, which they will become, of course, and they are criminalized. The responses that the United Irishmen have to go underground, including Thomas Addis Emmet, they will have their unsuccessful rebellion in 1798. Emmet will become, by 1797, one of the major figureheads of the movement. Although he is rather radical when it comes to, in particular, Catholic emancipation, but on issues of armed uprising, his position is, we can't do it without the French. If the French are not involved, it's not going to happen. It's not going to work. There's no point doing it. So he gets at loggerheads around 1797 with men like Arthur O'Connor about how they should move forward. The rebellion will occur in 1798. He will actually have been picked up by British forces in March of 1798. He's been tipped off by an informant, and he will be imprisoned, first in Kilmainham in Dublin, and then he'll be brought, like many of the leaders of the 1798 rebellion, to a place called Fort George, which is in Scotland. And he'll be kept there until 1802, which was the case for many of the kind of the top tier who were involved. He will come out in 1802. He'll move to Brussels. Shortly, he'll meet up with his brother, Robert Emmet, who is now rising to prominence. He'll be informed by Emmet, by his brother, by Robert, that he intends to provoke another rebellion in Ireland. It'll be the last time he'll see him. Between 1802, when he is released from prison, and 1804, when he goes to the United States, all of his family members will die. His eldest brother, of course, as I informed you at the beginning, had died young. Robert Emmet will be hanged on the docks of Dublin. He'll read out his famous speech calling that his eulogy should not be written until Ireland's able to take her rightful place among the nations of the world. And in 1803, his mother and his father both die. So he's effectively left by himself, at least genealogically, at this moment. He had been asked in 1799 if he would consider going to the United States, and he declined fairly vociferously, in part because he was imprisoned and it was very difficult for him to get out. But the United States in 1799 was also a very different place than it would be for Irish immigrants in 1804. It had been a federalist-run administration in 1799, but in 1804, it'll be run by Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, a party that were much more sympathetic toward the Irish case and toward the United Irish case. So he'll move to the United States in 1804, first to Washington, D.C., but here he'll come into contact with something that he always despised from a distance. This was slavery. He'll express this to a friend of his who's willing him to move further south again to Virginia. And what he'll say is like, I can't do it. I can't abide by slavery. The more slaves there are in a place, the worse there is. He had always set his eyes on New York City, although to practice law in New York City, you actually had to be a citizen. He was able to find a workaround, and he became part of the bar in New York City in 1805. And it's there in 1805 where he starts to put his anti-slavery politics into practice. He'll become involved in the New York Manumission Society, working to free escaped slaves who often escaped to New York City from the South. And he'll become prodigious in terms of his work. His most famous case will come in 1805 against the ship captain of a brig, of a ship called the Betty. A law had been passed in 1794, which was the Slave Trade Act in the United States, which explicitly said that you cannot outfit a ship in the United States and it to travel to Africa and then the Caribbean and back. It has to be, all slaves coming in have to be on ships that are not outfitted in the United States. It had been in effect since 1794, but it had never actually been prosecuted with. Thomas Addis Emmet will be the first one to do it in New York State, where he'll bring about the prosecution of the ship owner. And although the ship owner will eventually be able to get off, ironically in this current political moment, by not one but two presidential pardons. He'll continue his career working for the New York Manumission Society, almost always working pro bono, up until his death in 1827. He'll have minor but very important moments of political and career-based acclaim. He'll be the New York State Attorney General briefly in 1812, and he ran multiple benevolent societies in New York, including the Shamrock Society through the 18 teens. Something that I think we really should be talking about, this is kind of a glowing kind of portrait that I'm painting of Emmet, but Emmet is a very contradicting figure in many ways. This is not to make light of him or to slight him or anything like this. I think these amazing historical figures, the greatest honor you can give them is actually to investigate the contradictions and hypocrisies that make them such complex characters. Thomas Addis Emmet had always denounced slavery, but at particular moments he makes certain choices that run contrary to that. As much as he was working to help free slaves under these manumission cases, he was often defending the owners of slave ships that had also run amok against the law. So his positions on slavery, at least in the legal sense, were a little uneven, I would say, at times. In 1816, he'll write a pamphlet called Hints to Emigrants from Europe, specifically focusing on an Irish population back home. What should you do if you decide to come here? How to get along effectively, how to survive in the United States. And on slavery, he was fairly straightforward about it. He didn't denounce it. What he said explicitly was, if you have to do it to get by, if you have to become a slaveholder, if you have to become a slave trader, then do it. If that's what's necessary to maintain your status in the United States, then go right on ahead. So I'll kind of finish there on Thomas Addis Emmet with this focus on kind of the in theoretical shining portrayal of him, but with these contradictions that kind of marked his career.
Thanks very much, Maurice, for that complex portrait of Emmet. Really fascinating. So next up, Anne is going to talk to us about Nancy Cunard. So thank you very much, Anne.
Thanks so much. Thanks to the Douglas Week organizers and to Maurice for gathering us in this conversation. I'm very happy to be joining you from Brooklyn, although I wish I was in Cork to be there for the occasion. So Nancy Cunard was deeply engaged in anti-racist and anti-colonial politics, especially in the 1930s, when she published the expansive anthology Negro. She wrote newspaper articles for the Associated Negro Press. She organized on behalf of the Scottsboro Boys, and was involved in groups organizing for Black rights and decolonization. And in thinking about Cunard in the context of Douglas Week in Cork, I'm thinking about histories of transatlantic anti-slavery and anti-racist activism, the kinds of events and print culture that facilitated them, and also the role that some white women played in the movements, and how we might recover those histories, but also trouble them, kind of exploring the possibilities and also the limitations of solidarity when you're operating in solidarity in movements that might not be one's own. So Cunard was born in 1896 in England. She grew up wealthy in a house with 40 servants. Her mother eventually moved with her to London, where her mother had a salon. And in her early adulthood, Cunard was a poet and a publisher. She moved to France and established a press, the Hours Press, which published Laura Riding, Samuel Beckett, Ezra Pound, and others. And I will share my screen briefly just to show some images of her at the time that kind of give a sense of the circles that she was running. And these are on the National Portrait Gallery in the UK. So this is an older photo of her later in life in 1956. But here's one from 27 by Man Ray. She was famous for the bangles that she wore. This is one by Cecil Beaton, another one by Cecil Beaton. Her poem Parallax was published by Virginia and Leonard Woolf's Hogarth Press. And then a turning point came in her life in 1928 when she met the African-American musician Henry Crowder. They began a years-long relationship, and later in life, Cunard described Crowder as a man who introduced the whole world to me, and remarked, "Henry made me." So he made her aware of the oppression of African-Americans and the Black diaspora more broadly, and she took up political causes and publishing projects with this political project in mind. She also broke with her mother over her mother's racism, as was mentioned earlier, and she took a cut in the wealth that had supported her previously because of this rift with her mother. And she publicized the rift in a piece of writing called Black Man, White Ladyship that she published in 1931 in the NAACP publication, The Crisis, but also published herself as a pamphlet that she printed and sent to her social network that announced and condemned the racism of her mother and her social circle, who were all scandalized by Cunard's relationship with Henry Crowder. And if we think about this example in terms of white women engaging with anti-racism, there might be some limitations to the aspect of this particular model. And some of the strategies she uses that it quotes the racist remarks of her mother and her mother's friends kind of as the mode of critique. And that's something that comes up in Cunard's poetry and essays in the Negro Anthology as well, where she'll kind of adopt and incorporate voices of racists in order to disavow them. And it's sometimes not so successful. I think it's something that we've seen more recently as well, that merely letting racist remarks speak for themselves as critique isn't sufficient. But incorporating the voice of the racist in order to condemn it was not Cunard's only strategy. She was thinking about representation in some other ways as well, which is evidenced in some of the choices she made in organizing her 1934 anthology project. So a hugely ambitious and huge anthology. And I'll just show you an image here. The Negro Anthology, published in 1934, was wide-ranging in scope, from historical to musicological, art history, poetry, ethnographic writing, sociology. It spanned the Americas, Europe, Africa, And this is a digitized version that's in the New York Public Library's digital collections. You can get a sense of the contents here. It included contributions from Black writers, including Langston Hughes, who became a friend she would be in contact with for the rest of her life. It was the first publication of Zora Neale Hurston's ethnographic writing. It included Du Bois, Alain Locke, George Padmore, a whole host of writers, as well as white writers. And she worked with George Padmore, Kenyatta, Kouyaté, individuals who were involved in communist political organizing, who are from the Caribbean and Africa. And so her position as an editor of the anthology, it has a definite communist bent, but the collection included a wide range of ideological positions. And I thought I might just highlight the contribution on Frederick Douglass, which is taken from The Liberator, that draws a parallel between Douglass and the communist vice presidential candidate in 1932, James Ford. It argues that Douglass was the vice presidential candidate on the Equal Rights Party line in 1872. So I think the sub-headline there says, Frederick Douglass, great Negro leader, was named for vice president in 1872. Only the communists carry on his best practices or best traditions. And so the choices that Cunard made in the anthology are we can also consider them in terms of questions of white involvement in Black cultural production and political movements. In the call for contributors to the anthology, which was initially called Color, Cunard wrote, "I wish to receive contributions from Negroes. I want outspoken criticism, comment, and comparison from the Negro on the present-day civilizations of Europe, America, South America, the West Indies, African colonies, etc., where conditions are best for colored people." And she claimed, "This is the first time such a book has been compiled in this manner. It is primarily for the colored people, and it is dedicated to one of them." It was dedicated to Henry Crowder. Her first Negro friend was the dedication. "I wish by their aid to make it as inclusive as possible." So we have a statement of an intention that the audience and the contributors be primarily African diasporic people. And when she published the book, she published only author photographs with the Black authored texts, which was announced in the table of contents as a deliberate choice. Cunard's own writing in the anthology included the essay Scottsboro and Other Scottsboroughs. She was very involved in the International Scottsboro campaign in the 1930s to free 9 young Black men who were imprisoned, accused of raping 2 white women on a train in Alabama, and charges that were largely understood to be invented, as one of the women later admitted. So there's an international campaign that called for the release of the men. Communist political networks were active in this organizing. And so I think there's kind of a parallel to some of the transatlantic anti-slavery campaigns like Frederick Douglass's, or anti-lynching campaigns like Ida B. Wells, that a few decades after Wells, the Scottsboro campaign also involved transatlantic travel, events, speeches, and publications to create pressure for change in the US. And Cunard was active in this work. Her surveillance records in the British National Archives note that she traveled to London to attend a play. They have reports from informants on meetings that she attended. She organized a petition and letter writing campaign in Britain that garnered responses from writers, including Ezra Pound, Andre Gide, and Hope Muiris, as well as the Negro Welfare Association in London, which she was a member of. The Metropolitan Police file on her includes reports about her involvement in a group called the International Labor Defense London Colored Committee. As I mentioned, she also wrote for the Associated Negro Press, which was a Chicago-based news agency, which landed her articles in Black newspapers, as well as Sylvia Pankhurst's New Times and Ethiopia News. She wrote about the Italo-Ethiopian War when fascist Italy attacked Ethiopia, an event that was of major interest for African Americans and the African diaspora more broadly. And that also led her to anti-fascist activity in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, where she traveled there during the war. She published poetry, including Langston Hughes and a series of poetry pamphlets she created with Pablo Neruda, and wrote newspaper articles on the war there, including a profile of the African-American nurse Celeria Key, who married an Irish International Brigade soldier. At the end of the Spanish Civil War, she reported on the refugee camps in France. And a little bit later in the 1940s, she published a pamphlet with George Padmore, who was originally from Trinidad, The White Man's Duty, an Analysis of the Colonial Question in the Light of the Atlantic Charter. So just to wrap up, and I'm looking forward to talking more in the Q&A portion. And Cunard was an innovator of the open letter as her epistolary projects, The Black Man and White Ladyship, and later Authors Take Sides on the Spanish Civil War demonstrate. And she was also a master networker, as the variety of contributors to her 1,800-page Negro Anthology shows. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Anne. And that overview really covered a lot of really interesting points about Cunard and her activism, and what kind of resonances and parallels both back to Emmet and sort of to the contemporary day as well. So now we have the discussion portion of this conversation, and please, everyone in the audience, feel free to put in your own questions and contributions. Really, the sort of backstory of this event is that I have been really fascinated both in the history of race and Irish American, the Irish diaspora, and in the specific story of Nancy Cunard. And so I was really fascinated reading both scholarship of Muiris and Anne. And so I came up with this idea for this event, which is really just on a basic sense to kind of humor me and give me the chance to engage with this really fascinating story. But hopefully the audience as well, I think, can really engage with these two figures who I think speak to so many different complexities. I guess my first question for both of you is about how particular Cunard and Emmet's stance on race were with their own immediate political worlds, either Cunard's communist, cultural, bohemian world, or Emmet's world of United Irishmen exile. So what did race place them at odds with their colleagues and comrades, or was it a kind of a common ground? I suppose, Muiris, if you want to just go chronologically again.
Sounds good. Well, okay, so here's the thing with Emmet. Emmet is both an outlier in terms of his racial politics. He's also part of a strand of the more kind of radical United Irishmen that exists in the 1790s. How I would conceive of his racial politics are kind of a contradiction. They are both sophisticated, but they're also quite limited as well. And I'll give you a few examples of this. Emmet is able to see the broad anti-colonial brushstrokes of control of Ireland, of control of India, and the enslavement of African slaves. He's able to combine and see the kind of contours, much like Daniel O'Connell will do. He'll do the same thing, but he'll also include Aboriginals as well from Australia and New Zealand. But he'll be able to really detail the combined struggles at hand. That's interesting in and of itself. It's also quite limited, right? Because it also has a flattening effect, whereby the experiences of Irish Catholics are placed on a similar kind of mode of analysis as Black slaves, for example. So this kind of racial ideology, it fits and it doesn't fit in the United Irishmen. The United Irishmen kind of styled themselves as this very progressive group for the 1790s, and they are in certain respects. They are in terms of political reform. They are theoretically in terms of suffrage. They call for Catholic suffrage. There's no talk of like women ever playing a role in politics for the United Irishmen, although many behind the scenes very much so are. But formally, it's kind of, well, this is a man's world. This is a fraternal organization, and this will be men, Catholic men, who will get the vote, hypothetically. The other limited capacity of this racial ideology that the United Irishmen have, and that Thomas Addis Emmet feeds into, is that these comparisons were made throughout the 1790s, in particular by people like Wolfe Tone, about the comparisons between the Irish between the Irish Catholic and the black slave. Seemingly, but before 1798, this will be a cornerstone of the movement. What we'll see after their exile, after 1798, in particular, the many who go to the United States, they have no qualms about owning slaves in this moment. What it really shows is that while there was sympathy, although there was skepticism about the inclusion of Irish Catholics into voting rights and into political participation, there was almost no consistent, sincere suggestion of such a program for black slaves, with the exception of a few people. Samuel Nielsen in Belfast is one of them. William Sampson, who will go to the United States as well, will also become involved in the manumission societies, and Thomas Addis Emmet to a limited extent. So to answer your question, Emmet is both part of the fringe of the United Irishmen in terms of racial ideology, but he's also part of the broader kind of limited social ideology that the United Irishmen have broadly.
Thanks very much, Maurice. And then Anne, the same question.
Yeah, I think with Cunard, she wasn't alone. She was definitely taking part in like networks and political communities that were thinking along the same lines of that she was. And so I think answering the question maybe depends on defining like what world we're placing her into. Certainly the world that she was born into, I think this wasn't like the logical, where she ended up wasn't like a sort of preordained path, that there was a break, and that but that she was kind of joining a political movement, I guess. And yeah, I think that she was never a Communist Party member, but she was very engaged in I guess fellow traveler kinds of politics. Like I have a facsimile copy of the Negro Anthology, and on the back, the Communist Party for African Americans had the Negro question called for a black belt in the United States, where that would be sort of the location of African Americans to realize like a nation within a nation. And so she kind of features the black belt on the cover of the Negro. And so I think she's picking up and taking part in conversations. It's just maybe the conversations that she has like inserted herself into or come into conversation with that is somewhat unusual. What do you think, Maurice?
Yeah, well, one thing just it came to my mind because you wrote the Black Belt thesis. I bring everything back to Ireland, and Harry Haywood, who was one of the leading theorists of the Black Belt thesis in the Communist Party, was an African American who lived in Moscow, and he shared a room with an Irish communist while in Moscow, and he claimed that this sort of link between an Irish person's idea of independence was important to conceptualizing that. So that's just anecdote kind of jumped into my mind. But yeah, I think Cunard, within her own well, she's kind of unusual in communist politics, in that there were very few what we would call sort of white allies within that world of race and politics within communism as prominent as her. And I think that is kind of interesting, and it speaks to this very peculiar role that she crafted for herself as someone at these intersections of communism, but not party membership, and the cultural worlds and so on, which allowed her to kind of attain that status. And I think that's what kind of interests me within her political world. I guess as well, before, because we have a few audience questions, but I guess we should also try, because of the nature of the event, to link these two people together. I know for me, I haven't been able to get into the archive with this question of how did this Irish link matter to Cunard, but you can pick up some details. I remember from when Muiris was speaking, one thing that Cunard did speak about, and which she was quite proud of, was the Fort George link. And she used to talk about how she had an Irish ancestor who was imprisoned in Scotland. And she used to kind of lionize this idea of rebelliousness and use that Irish sense of rebelliousness to explain her own sort of personal rebelliousness. But I also wondered what you both think of thinking through these two figures to what it, to sort of chart a lineage, maybe not just a political lineage from Irish republicanism to Nancy Cunard's own politics, but a lineage of understandings of race and the arc, the supposed arc bending towards justice, which is actually going in all sorts of different directions, and how those two figures might allow us to talk about how understandings of race have transformed from their worlds to ours. So yeah, I don't know who wants to go first. Feel free.
I can try to answer it. I mean, it's a big question, right? I think it's important when you talk about race that we think about progress isn't linear. I think that we should be skeptical of a progressive narrative where we consider that all things are getting better all of the time. In this case, racially, we see this to be false. I think that there should be skepticism at the same time of a kind of a declension narrative where everything is getting worse. And I think that the truth lies somewhere in the middle, where when it comes to, what I write about, these green and the black Atlantic, the coming together, the relationship between Irishness and blackness. And there are certain arcs, of course. Of course, we're not talking about this in this moment. Daniel O'Connell is a perfect example of this. Daniel O'Connell, ardent abolitionist, will lose so much support in the United States in the 1820s and the 1830s for the repeal movement because he refuses, in theory, to take money from slaveholders, or for people, even from people who refuse to acknowledge to support the abolitionist movement. Right, an entire generation of Irish Americans in the United States in the 1840s and 1850s, for a lot of complex reasons, not just because they're racist, right, but because they've become embedded with the Democratic Party in the 1840s because of the Know Nothing Party, who are so anti immigration. So it's very complex. So I think being aware of how history moves, how it's not, back. It's not just a straight line. It's not always going slightly up. It's not just getting better, right? But that there are ebbs and there are flows in, particularly with Irish history along the lines of race.
And yeah, I guess, and what do you think, Cunard, looking at where we are with racial justice today, would Cunard have been surprised, or would she have expected us to be at this place?
An interesting question. I mean, I suspect, your question makes me think about like there's the sort of two sides of her Irish heritage. There's the like rebellion, the identification with the rebellion part, and then there's the Irish Americanness of her mother, who was like the racist that she disavowed, and that might sort of pick up on some of the histories of Irish immigrants in the U.S. and their involvement in the slave trade and today, white supremacy and related movements. And so, yeah, today, I don't know, I imagine that she would have maybe a similar analysis to what she did in the 30s of calling out the ways that white people are not sort of standing up. I think there's something maybe to be considered about even for the white people who are taking these anti-racist positions, the kinds of like limitations of the strategies they take, or that she was so. I was reading the introduction by Maureen Moyna of there's a collection of Cunard's writings on race and empire, and she sort of talks about how Cunard was anti-imperialist but writing with imperial eyes, and so that there's kind of like a way that you can't escape the world that you grew up in and the the privileges that you have. I guess that's the way that we might talk about it today, but that I think sometimes with her you sort of see like an assumption of a certain authority to criticize like Du Bois or McKay. She would sort of say like that race consciousness isn't enough, or she would be have very critical stances that are sometimes awkward or uncomfortable to read now coming from her, and so I think that continues to be maybe a tension, I guess.
Thanks. There are some audience questions as well. The first two will be specific for both of you. First, for Muiris, a question from Peter. Regarding Emmet's contradictions in slavery, are there examples of cases where he defended slave ship captains?
Right. The one that comes to mind, it's a case in 1820. The name of the ship is the Cyan, which is Cyane. And it's in this moment by 1820 that there is the Atlantic slave trade has been outlawed to a certain extent. The American government has set up a squadron of, I think, 4 or 5 ships that are sent to the West African coast to enforce Atlantic rules around slave trading. All 6 ships will allegedly be involved in slave trading. Actually, Emmet will be called upon to defend the shipping company, or the I think it was either the captain of the ship or it was, I can't remember the exact. I don't know who the plaintiff exactly was, but there would be, in the end, there wouldn't be enough evidence in part because on the day where the Cyan was apprehended and thought to be slave trading, there were no actual slaves on the ship, so there was he won the case. So that's the most prevalent case that I think about in this moment.
Thanks. And then for Anne, and this is an incident I'd never heard of. It's very interesting. From Seamus asking about Cunard's presence on the 1948 Windrush voyage bringing West Indians to the UK. Was it coincidental or planned?
Yeah, I don't know a ton about this. I haven't done my outside research on it, but my understanding is that it was coincidental. But it's kind of a fascinating coincidence to imagine her arriving with on the Windrush with this beginning of mass immigration from West Indians to the UK. And I was just thinking about how these two first questions are so Black Atlantic, the figure of the ship featuring in both of them.
No, it's fascinating. I'd never realized that happened. Someone needs to write that play. That should be on the National Theatre. That would be really, really good. So here's kind of a broad question that I think perhaps we'll be able to speak to you on some level. Were there many Irish involved in the slave trade? Some Irish who settled across the Atlantic were slave owners themselves. Are there enough available records we can access either here in Ireland, online, or otherwise? So I guess my own thoughts on this is there's more and more emerging scholarship on who the Irish enslavers were and where they were and where Irish enslavement or where Irish involvement in the slave trade existed. It can, for now you can go onto that database of British slave owners online and you can look and search on that on the maps you can see in Ireland, but that's limited. That's only going to tell you the Irish slave owners who were compensated for their enslaved people after the abolition of the slave trade in the British Empire. You need to then look at Irish slave owners in places like Cuba, and there's a lot of great scholarship on that. And also looking at Irish slave owners in the US. So what this really needs, and thankfully there is a generation of scholars working on this, is really detailed archival research combined with genealogy to say, these Irish names that we're finding in US records and Cuban records and so on, where are they? What background are they coming from? And what is being revealed is that these slave owners are coming from, it's not just, as some people like to try and exculpate Ireland by saying, well, it's just wealthy Protestants. No, it's all levels of Irish society were involved in this from all different religious backgrounds. So yeah, it's a really sort of emerging field. Yeah, I guess perhaps that kind of answers it, unless anyone else wants to speak to Irish involvement in slavery. Another question there is it hard to get a sense of their personalities outside of their work in racial justice? And I'm less aware of this for Emmet than I am for Cunard, but Cunard's personality certainly seems to be irrepressible, at least in biographies of her or what kind of writing you can find out about her, not just in racial justice, but particularly in cultural productions as well. Yeah, if anyone else wants to.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Her personality comes through pretty strongly.
I would say Emmet less so. He is somebody who, his personality comes through when it comes to Catholic emancipation. That's his big thing. That's the thing that he feels most strongly about. In the United States, and he has memoirs, we have all of these letters. There are certain members of the United Irishmen, like Samuel Nielsen. He will be involved with actually Luda Equiano visiting Belfast in 1791. He's an escaped slave, like a predecessor in many ways to Frederick Douglass. Samuel Nielsen is somebody who is larger than life when it comes to the question of Black slavery and how immoral it is. Emmet is, I think he speaks a lot more. Well, again, it's complicated because of the contradictions he has at play. But often his actions are deemed to speak louder than the words that he uses. He writes about it, but it's quite seldom, curiously enough. But he had multiple slave manumission cases. So, and did them pro bono as well. So there's something to be said there.
Thanks. So we have one last question from Jerry Mullenby. Would the academic contributors have any thoughts on what Emmet or Cunard's opinions might be on direct provision today? Direct provision, of course, being the system for asylum seekers in Ireland, which has been labelled by none other than the UN as a serious violation of human rights. Well, of course, they're not with us today to speak about it, but it would certainly be consistent with Cunard's politics to denounce direct provision and to denounce any kind of system that racializes people, that places people in unjust forms of incarceration. So that would be my thoughts.
Yeah, I also think of her work at the end of the Spanish Civil War. There were refugees that crossed the border into France that were kept in camps there. And she did a ton of newspaper reporting, sort of advocating for the conditions to be improved there in terms of kind of human rights activity. And she also was involved in like personally getting some people out of the camps and getting them into, I guess, living in Paris. So I could sort of see perhaps that's where sort of the association my mind makes.
And for Emmet too, I would say would reject direct provision for a variety of reasons. I think his own time kind of imprisoned, first of all. I think his exile, I think he was a firm believer in the free movement of people. His work with benevolent societies in New York City in particular, helping newly arrived immigrants get on their feet, and then of course the letter or the pamphlet that he wrote, Hints to Immigrants in 1816, kind of encouraging migration from Europe, all suggest that these are not. Oh, and then the final part of it, that he wasn't allowed to practice law in New York because he wasn't a citizen. Originally, he was able to find a workaround, but it was a long and tedious and expensive process. So yeah, I would say he would reject direct provision.
Well, I think that's a good note for us to end on. So to bring it to a close, just to really thank my two panelists, Muiris and Anne. It's been wonderful and fascinating. Thank you all for attending, particularly those of you who asked questions. It's I've really had a great time. So thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to all our panelists for a really engaging discussion and for all the questions that came in on the chat. We really appreciate you being here. And we hope that you'll stick around. We have another panel beginning right now, Reform Through Photography with Professor John Stauffer. And later on, we have a poetry evening where Roger Granvere-Smith is going to be reading the winning poem of our poetry competition. So I hope you'll be able to stick around with us this Friday evening or Friday morning, wherever you are. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great evening. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Bye.